Welcome to California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance, and we are joined today by Senator George Runner. He is a member of the Board of Equalization. And when you were serving in the California State Senate, you were the lead sponsor of a bill that ultimately went to the voters known as Jessica's Law.
Right.
Give us some background
on
Jessica's Law.
What happened? Jessica's Law was a bill or a concept that was running all over the country as a result of the death of Jessica Lunsford and her kidnapping and death. In terms of just looking at the strength of laws protecting kids.
And what we knew about the perpetrator against Jessica was what?
Well, we knew about that perpetrator is that he actually was a previous perpetrator. He was on GPS, and as soon as he took his GPS out, he went and kidnapped Jessica.
Right, and he was a sex offender.
And he was a sex offender.
And that really was the motivation to look at how and where previously convicted sex offenders who have been released, where can they live?
And also the terms of that a sex offender would serve. So Jessica's Law, it had different kinds of application, different states. In California then, we tried to introduce the concepts and the laws in the legislature. We were not successful, so then we had to go to the ballot initiative. We did. And in Jessica's Law, there were a series of issues. One was increased penalties. For instance, that's the first time, for instance, possession of child pornography went from a misdemeanor to a felony, along with other kinds of civil commitments for sexually violent predators. How long could they stay? Those issues, along with longer terms, prison terms. So we did that. It also had the whole issue of GPS. The idea of strapping on a GPS to certain sex offenders when they come out of prison. And then it also was this issue of distancing.
And that's the key for our discussion today. As you know, the California Supreme Court was presented with a case out of San Diego County. And in San Diego County, the court had ruled that lifetime restrictions on residency, those bans, the court ultimately upheld the San Diego decision, which said you cannot have a lifetime ban.
Well, at least at the 2,000 feet distance.
And that's the key. And so let's talk about that, sir, because it is a very compelling point. Under Jessica's Law, an individual convicted and released cannot live within 2,000 feet of a school or park. What folks have been saying is that distance is just too large.
Well, it depends on the community. I think it depends on the community, and I think what we found is, and that's the challenge of having an initiative. An initiative gets written, you got to do it, and I always say it's a blunt instrument, and we know that. And so what you have to do your best research, getting ready, and then you find out things. And so within Jessica's Law, there were actually provisions then for changes. Because you want to do that. You don't have to go back to the populace to say, hey, we need to make this adjustment. And so within Jessica's Law, there was provisions when something needed to be adjusted. And let me just say, when we picked 2,000 feet, it's not like there's a magic number
how did that number surface?
We actually brought it out of, we looked at distances, and we saw, number one, the state already had distances. Up even larger than up to a quarter of a mile, up to a half a mile. And
2,000 feet is about
just less than a half a mile.
Got it.
Okay. And so there were already some provisions with certain kinds of offenders that were a half a mile. So we were coming down off of that. Plus, 2,000 feet had been tested in some other cases across the country, in some other states. So we thought that's a good. We'll just use that number.
But what we know out of San Diego, at least according to the ruling, is that 2,000 feet is simply too large. What the court said, either the San Diego court or the Supreme Court, is that 97% of San Diego became off limits.
Well, again, it depends where population is, because there's a lot of places in rural San Diego County that has plenty of issues. But you know, as the discussion went on, and as the law passed, we saw these are basically sex offenders making the case. These are sex offenders who are feeling like they want to live somewhere. And our bottom line is, we knew that people of California knew it was wrong for a child molester to live across the street from their child's school. It was wrong for a serial rapist to live across the street from their daughter's high school. We just knew that was the case, how people felt. And it was really, you can get all these ideas, is it really safe? Are they really at risk? At the end of the day, you just know you don't like that.
But what's interesting is, you knew, and if I may say, new Senator Sharon Runner, who's coming back, knew as the law got implemented,
Right.
that there were some issues.
Right. We knew that there were some issues with communities, that this is a problem. It was never our intention. And so we actually introduced a bill.
Right.
What that bill said was if a sex offender could not find a residence within that 2,000 feet, there was a way for them to go to appeal to the local superior court. The judge could take a look and say, oh, you're right. Therefore, in this area, it's this number. We thought that was a reasonable way for us to then be able to apply it. And that way, you don't have to then change it like in Lassen County, where you might have plenty of places.
Sure.
You don't have to then make it less and less in Lassen County. You can make it, tailor it to what works right.
Now, interestingly, SB 54, as it was known then, did not pass.
No, the legislature at that point just did not want to address the issue.
So,
I think part of the reason was, I think part of the reason was at that point, they wanted to not feel like they were lessening an issue with sex offenders. And so I think that was probably some of the motivation. They could feel like they could
kind of ironic because you're the kind of
it's kind of like we're the authors.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of like, well, we authored it. We're willing to go ahead and do this.
Right.
I think that was part of the reason. And maybe they wanted to see what happened with these court challenges.
So we know what happened.
Right.
And so I know that you're not in the legislature now, but someone named Sharon Runner is, and she and you were part of the team that put this together. I know she's independent, she's not here today, but is your sense that Senator Sharon Runner may look to reintroduce something like SB 54?
I think there's a couple of issues. I think there'll probably be three main issues that I think make sense to take a look at. One is the issue of distance. Right. Nothing magic about 2,000 feet. Should that be a smaller issue, even across the state?
Right.
You know, is 1,000 feet a more reasonable issue?
And if I can interrupt, even though the Jessica's Law was passed via initiative, the legislature can tinker with it.
With the 2/3 vote, the legislature can go ahead and change the initiative. So that's how we put that in the law.
Sure.
So that would be one thing. The other issue is there might be certain kinds of offenders that you don't need to include.
Yeah.
So I think that there could be a smaller amount focused on some issue that would be the kinds of folks who you specifically need to deal with.
And I know that's been a big issue with folks, and again, I am not endorsing this behavior, but maybe a 19-year-old was in a relationship with a 17-year-old, and that resulted in sexual
rape. And I think that could be another
Right.
adjustment that you would do, and probably still go to the core of the issue is you don't want the molester living across the street from the school. So the last thing then would be the issue of the appeal. Because even if you do 1,000 feet or 1,500 feet, there's still going to be somebody who says, I don't have a place to live. So then you keep the appeal process in there for the local superior court then to make a judgment.
So under the Supreme Court ruling, which recently came out, is the door open to make these adjustments?
Well, I think what would happen is they basically threw out the 2,000 feet in San Diego County.
Which is,
now,
could you explain that to me?
Well,
I used to be a lawyer, but why is it just San Diego County?
They took the facts of San Diego County and then they made their decision based upon that. I've never been a lawyer, so I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
So I would assume what would happen is if there was another county,
they
would then just probably, somebody would go ahead and take it to court. The court would quickly look at what the Supreme Court did, and then that would be the end of the discussion. So I think that would be the path that it would probably go down. So I don't believe for a moment that this is just held at San Diego County. I think this will now proceed through other counties where sex offenders say, I need to live in places that are within 2,000 feet of schools.
And I think it's important that you describe for us what the court did and did not do, because I think some of the headlines were Jessica's Law struck down.
Right.
That is not accurate.
No, just one portion of it only had to deal with it. There's another issue that we're actually looking at, and that is within Jessica's Law, we also put in the fact that local governments could add other sites and another
interesting.
For instance, like a children's museum.
Interesting.
And so there could be a path for a local government in San Diego County, for instance, to say under that provision, we think the number is 1,000 feet around schools. Under that part of the provision of Jessica's Law. That's one that we're still taking a look at. But I think there's going to be room for more discussion. And quite frankly, I'm hoping that the appetite for the legislature will be better now to say, hey, look, the courts, this is already at risk. The courts have already spoken, and there'll be less risk for legislators. Because if they don't, the fact is, in San Diego County, a sex offender who's a child molester can live across the street from a school, and that's what we know people don't want.
And as a member of the BOE now, can you engage? I mean, I know you're dealing with tax issues.
Well,
so
as a citizen,
or someone that likes to talk,
and as a citizen, and certainly somebody who dealt with the law, we can engage in terms of that discussion.
His name is George Runner. He's a member of the BOE. My name is Brad Pomerance. We thank you so much for watching California Edition from Sacramento.